some fall to bits. I can see this one's going to do the same. More slowly and maybe more nastily. It's queer, isn't it? Decent intentions seem to be the most dangerous things around just now. A damn shame because this place could be managed, in spite of the proportionate blind. Everything it needs is lying about for the taking and will be for a while.
Ocean here, and I'm here to do a cartoon of Marvin Gaye.
That too. You agreed?
I don't even know that I even like this picture of Marvin Gaye or not, but he looked pretty nice on it. I don't see what I could do with it. I need to just really take out time to find out pictures that I like, that I want to do, you know, other than just grabbing something. But he looked nice anyway, so I listened to the audiobook the day of the Triffers.
Well, they've got to start realizing it soon if they're going to get through, Coca said, looking round the hall again.
It's been kind of a long day for me. It's been kind of a long day, for me for not day.
Time's no longer money, you know.
How should I put
Money
it?
isn't important any longer.
Every day
Time
been
is.
kind of long for me.
They ought to
That's
be
just
thinking
like
about
I
the
put it.
harvest, rigging a mill
It's
to
been
grind
kind of
flour,
pretty
saying about
long.
winter feed for the stock. I shook my head. Not as urgent as all that, Coca. There must be huge stocks of flour in the towns, and by the look of things, mighty few of us to use it. We can live on capital for a long while yet. Surely the immediate job is to teach the blind how to work before they really have to get down to it. All the same, unless something is done, the sighted ones here are going to crack up. It only needs that to happen to one or two of them, and the place will be a proper mess. I had to concede that. Later in the afternoon, I managed to find Miss Durrant. No one else seemed to know or care where Michael Beatley and his lot had gone, but I could not believe that they had not left behind some indications for those who might follow. Miss Durrant was not pleased. At first I thought she was going to refuse to tell me. It was not due solely to my implied preference for other company. The loss of even an uncongenial, able-bodied man was serious in the circumstances. Nevertheless, she preferred not to show the weakness of asking me to stay. In the end, she said curtly, "They were intending to make for somewhere near Beaminster in Dorset. I can tell you no more than that." I went back and told Coca. He looked around him. Then he shook his head, though with a touch of regret. "Okay," he said. "We'll check out of this
I'm not
dump
gonna do
tomorrow."
the beard,
Spoken like a
the
pioneer.
mustache, and all that just yet.
At least, more like a pioneer than an Englishman. 9 o'clock the next morning saw us already 12 miles or so on our road, and travelling as before in our 2 lorries. There had been a question whether we should not take a handier vehicle and leave the trucks for the benefit of the Tyneside people, but I was reluctant to abandon mine. I had personally collected the contents and knew what was in it. Apart from the case of anti-Triffid gear of which Michael Beatley had so disapproved, I had given myself slightly wider scope on the last load, and there was a selection of things made with consideration of what might be difficult to find outside a large town. Such things as a small lighting set, some pumps, cases of good tools. All these things would be available later for the taking, but there was going to be an interlude when it would be advisable to keep away from towns of any size. The Tyneside people had the means to fetch supplies from towns where there was no sign yet of the disease. A couple of loads would not make a great deal of difference to them either way, so in the end, we went as we had come.
And if you have
The weather still held good.
Tourette's like
On higher
me, then
ground,
your
there was still
hands is
little
not gonna
taint
be
to the
straight
fresh
just
air,
like mine.
though most villages become unpleasant. Rarely we saw a still figure lying in a
just
field
do
or
what
by
you
the
can.
roadside. But just as in
If
London,
you have
the main
Tourette's
instinct seemed to have been to hide away in shelter of some
and
kind.
bad vision, that's not
Most
good
of the
next
villages
needed.
showed
But
empty streets.
this is what I'm going
The
to do.
countryside around them was as deserted as if the whole human race and most of its animals had been spirited away. Until we came to Steeple
If you
Honey.
can't fix the problem, then do the
From our
picture
road,
over
We
again.
had a view of the whole of Steeple Honey as we descended the hill. It clustered at the
Or
further end of a stone bridge which arched
And
across a
if you
small
can't fix the
sparkling river.
problem, you gotta do the
It
picture
was a
again.
quiet
See,
little place,
like that.
centered round a sleepy-looking
I ain't
church,
had to do it
and
over
stippled
again.
off at its edges with whitewashed cottages. It did not look as if anything had occurred in a century
Alright,
or more to
so
disturb the quiet life under its
problem
thatched roof.
fixed.
But like other
his
villages,
eyes
was now
was
without
pretty
stir or
lazy in
smoke.
this picture.
Then,
He looked
when we were
nice,
halfway
but
down the
I
hill,
don't know. Just
the movement
I'm
caught my eye.
wondering, do I just need to go and
On the left at the far end of the
just
bridge,
get another
one
picture
house
or
stood
just
slightly
continue
aslant
on
from the
with
road
it?
so that it faced
I'm gonna
obliquely
see
at
how
the
this
horses.
go. It just don't
An
go the
inside
way
hung from a bracket on its wall, and from the window
inspiring.
immediately
Then
above that something
I'm
white
gonna
was
go
being
and
waved.
find another
As we
picture,
came
but
closer,
I'll see.
I could see the man who was leaning out and frantically flagging us with a
Okay, so
towel.
let's do his
I
skin
judged that he must be
complexion
blind,
first.
otherwise he would have come out into the road to intercept
His
us.
skin.
He was waving too vigorously for a sick man. I signaled back to Coca and pulled up as we cleared the bridge. The man at the window dropped his towel. He shouted something which I could not hear above the noise of the
I'm
engine.
gonna see how this yellow
We both switched off.
and this brown dude.
It was so quiet that we could hear the clumping of the man's feet on the
Brown
wooden stairs inside the house.
and
The door
yellow.
opened, and he stepped out, holding both hands before him. Like lightning,
So I
something
think
whipped out
I
of the
might
hedge on
want
his
to
left
try
and struck
the,
him.
I don't know, let
He
me
gave a
keep my
single
option
high-pitched
open
shout
first. Let me
and
keep my
dropped away to
option
still.
open.
I picked up my shotgun and climbed out of the cab. I circled a little until I could make out the Triffid skulking in the shadows of a bush. Then I blew the top off it. Coca was out of his truck too and standing close beside me. He looked at the man on the ground, and then at the shorn Triffid. It was like
So I think I'm going to use, I'm not think, but I am going to use the
it must just have
premium
happened.
color yellow
You couldn't have known he'd
and
come
the
out of that
crazy
door.
art toasted toffee. Toasted toffee is my favorite. I'm not gonna lie, it really is my favorite.
Or could it?
And so I'm gonna put this down first, then the yellow.
Coca turned uneasy eyes on me. Damn neat. You don't really believe. There's a kind of conspiracy not to believe things about Triffids, I said, and added, there might be more around here. We looked the adjacent cover over carefully and drew blank. I could do with a drink.
And try not to sponge the picture
But for the dust on the
because
counter,
the
the small bar at the inn looked
premium
dull.
color will
We poured a
smudge.
whiskey each. Coca downed his in one. He turned a worried look on me. I didn't like that. Not at all, I didn't. You ought to know a lot more about these bloody things than most people do. I mean, it wasn't, I mean, it must just have happened to be there, mustn't it? I think, I began. Then I stopped, listening to the staccato drumming outside. I walked over and opened the window. I let the already trimmed Triffid have the other barrel too, this time just above the bowl. The drumming stopped. The trouble about Triffids, I said as we poured another drink, is chiefly the things we don't know about them. I told him one or two of Walter's theories. He started. You don't seriously suggest that they're talking when they make that rattling noise? I've never made up my mind, I admitted. I'll go so far as to say I'm sure it's a signal of some sort. But
Now
Walter
we'll
considered
use
it to be
the
real talk.
premium color
He
yellow.
didn't know more about them than anyone else that I know. I ejected the two spent cartridge cases and reloaded. And he actually mentioned their advantage over a blind man. A number of years ago that was, I pointed out. Still,
And
it's a
try
funny
not to
coincidence.
press too hard on it
Impulsive
because
as
you
ever,
don't want the
I said.
picture to come out
Nearly
yellow.
any stroke of fate can be made to look like a
Either
funny
we'll go back
coincidence if you
over
try
it
hard enough and wait
again
long
with the
enough.
brown. You still want
We
to be
drank
careful
up 10
about
to go.
how much you
Coca
do
glanced out of the
use,
window.
you know.
Then he caught my arm, pointed. Two Triffids had swayed round the corner and were making for the hedge which had been the hiding place of the first. I waited until they paused and then decapitated both of them. We left by the window, which was out of range of any Triffid cover, and looked about us carefully as we approached the lorries. Another coincidence? Or were they coming to see what had happened to their pal? Asked Coca. We cleared the village, running on along small cross-country roads. There seemed to me to be more Triffids about now than we had seen on our previous journey. Or was it that I had been made more conscious of them? It might have been that in travelling hitherto chiefly by main roads we had encountered fewer. I knew from experience that they tended to avoid a hard surface, and thought that it perhaps caused them some discomfort in their limb-like roots.
Okay, so I got that down. Now I'm gonna go back over there again. I don't know, maybe not with the toasted toffee, but with another color.
Whether those that we saw approaching across fields from time to time just happened to be coming in our direction. A more decisive incident occurred when one slashed at me from the hedgerow as I passed. Luckily, it was inexpert in its aim at a moving vehicle. It let fly a moment too soon and left its print in little dots of poison across the windscreen. I was past before it could strike again. But thenceforward, in spite of the warmth, I drove with the near side window.
I'm gonna use the crazy art brown,
During the past week,
and I'm just gonna go over it gladly. You know, gladly go over it.
Those I had seen at Josella's home,
You know what?
as had the others that had attacked our
I just realized something.
But
It's
most
supposed
of
to
the
be
time there had
a
been more
little
immediate things to worry
mustache
about.
beard right here.
But looking back now over our trip,
So
the state of things at times should before
let me go over it
steps to clear
again.
it up with shotguns, and the condition of the villages we had passed through. I began to wonder just how big a part the Triffids might have been playing in the disappearance of the inhabitants. In the next village, I drove slowly and looked carefully. In several of the front gardens, I could see bodies lying as they had evidently lain for some days, and almost always there was a Triffid discernible close by. It looked as if the
I'll
Triffids
worry
only
about that
ambushed in
later. I just
places
want to
where
get
there was
this part
soft
done.
earth for them to dig their
But
roots
yeah,
into while
so
they
let me
waited.
get to
Well, someone
shading
saw a
it.
body, and never a Triffid, in those parts where the house doors opened straight into the street. At a guess, I would say that what had happened in most of the villages was that the inhabitants emerging for food moved in comparative safety while they were in paved areas. But the moment they left them, or even passed close to a garden wall or fence, they stood in danger of the stings slashing out at them. Some would cry out as they were struck, and when they did not come back, those who remained would grow more afraid. Now and then another would be driven out by hunger. A few might be lucky enough to get back, but most would lose themselves and wander on until they dropped or came within range of a Triffid. Those who were left might perhaps guess what was happening. Where there was a garden, they might have heard the swish of the sting and known that they faced the alternatives of starvation in the house, or the same fate that had overtaken the others who had left it. Many would remain there, living on what food they had while they waited for help that was never going to come. Something like that must have been the predicament of the man in the inn at Steeple Honey.
They hit the camera by mistake.
The likelihood that in the other villages we were passing through there might still be houses in which isolated groups had managed to keep going was not a pleasant thought. It raised again the same kind of question that we had faced in London. The feeling that one should, by all civilized standards, try to find them and do something for them. And the frustrating knowledge of the frittering decline which would overtake any such attempt as it had before.
Okay, so I'm gonna get the
Same
white
old question.
and
What
go a
could
certain
one do
across
with
his
the best
face
will
with
in the
the
world but prolong
premium
the
color
anguish?
white.
Placate one's conscience for a while again, just to see the result of the effort wasted once more. It was not, I had to tell myself firmly, any good at all going into an earthquake area while the buildings were still falling. The rescue and the salvage had to be done when the tremors had stopped.
Okay, so now I'm going to get the black.
The old doctor had been only too right
This is
to
the
stress the difficulties of mental
premium
adaptation.
color black.
The Triffids were a complication on an unexpected scale. There were, of course, very many nurseries besides our own company's plantations. They raised them for us, for private buyers, or for sale to any number of lesser trades where their derivatives were used, and the majority of them were for climactic reasons, situated in the south. Nevertheless, if what we had already seen was a fair sample of the way they had broken loose and distributed themselves, they must have been far more numerous than I had supposed. The prospect of more of them reaching maturity every day, and of the docked specimens steadily regrowing their stings, was far from reassuring. With only 2 more stops, one for food and the other for fuel, we made good time, and ran into Beaminster about 4:30 in the afternoon. We had come right into the centre of the town without having seen a sign to suggest the presence of the Beadley party. At first glimpse, the place was as void of life as any other we had seen that day. The main shopping street we entered was bare and empty, save for a couple of lorries drawn up on one side. on it for perhaps 20 yards when a man stepped out from behind one of the lorries and leveled a rifle. He fired deliberately over my head and then lowered his aim. Chapter 12. Dead End. That's the kind of warning I don't debate about. I pulled up. The man was large and fair-haired. He handled his rifle with familiarity. Without taking it out of the aim, he jerked his head twice sideways. I accepted that as a sign to climb down. When I had done so, I displayed my empty hands. Another man, accompanied by a girl, emerged from behind the stationary lorry as I approached it. Coco's voice called from behind me. Better put out that rifle, chum, you're all in the open. The fair man's eyes left mine to search for Coco. I could have jumped him then if I'd wanted to, but I said, he's right. Anyway, we're peaceful. The man lowered his rifle, not quite convinced. Coco emerged from the cover of my lorry, which had hidden his exit from his own. What's the big idea, dog eat dog? He inquired. Only two of you? The second man asked. Coco looked at him. What would you be expecting, a convention? Yes, just two of us. The trio visibly relaxed. The fair man explained. We thought you might be a gang from a city. We've been expecting them here raiding for food. Oh, said Coco, from which we assume that you've not taken a look at any city lately. If that's your only worry, you might as well forget it. What gangs there are more likely to be
So I'm
working the
gonna
other
get
way
the
around.
crazy all white and try to smooth his face
If I
out.
may say so,
I'm gonna come back and do that, but I just want to go and get this part out the way.
I'm darn sure they won't.
Try not to smudge the picture too, because the picture will try smudge on you.
He asked. The response was convincingly blank. Pity, said Coco. That'd have been our first real stroke of luck in quite a time. What is or are Beadley's lot? Inquired the fair man. I was feeling wilted and
No,
dry
Marvin
after
Gaye, he
some
was a good
hours in the driving
singer.
cab with the sun on it.
Real
I
good.
suggested
Had a
that
lot
we
of
might
women
remove the
too.
discussion from the middle of the street to some more congenial
Yes, I
spot.
think it was a shame that his
They
daddy
passed
killed
around
him.
their vans through a familiar litter of cases of biscuits, chests of
Daddy
tea,
killed him
sides of bacon,
just
sacks
because
of
he was
sugar,
trying to stop his
bottles
mama.
of salt and all the
Stop
rest of it,
him.
to a small
Stop
bar
him for
parlour next
beating
door.
on his mama.
Over pint pots, Coco
And I
and I
think
gave
that's
him a short
sad.
resume of what we'd done and what we knew. Then it was their turn.
So he's supposed to sit back and just watch his
They were,
daddy
it seemed, the
go
more
on his
active half
mama.
of a party of six. The other two women and a man being stationed at the house they had taken over for a base. Around the noon of Tuesday the 7th of May, the fair-haired man and the girl with him had been travelling westwards in his car. They'd been on their way to spend a 2 weeks holiday in Cornwall and making pretty good time until a double-decker bus emerged from a turning
I
somewhere
think I
near
need to put
Crooked.
just a little bit more right here.
The car had made contact with it in a decisive way, and the last thing the fair-haired young man remembered was a horrified glimpse of the bus looking as tall as a cliff and heaving over right above them. He had wakened up in bed to find, much as I had, a mysterious silence all about it. Apart from soreness, a few cuts and a thumping head, there didn't appear to be a lot wrong with him. When, as he said, nobody kept on coming, he had investigated the place and found it to be a small cottage
Hold
hospital.
on for a minute. Try to listen to my
In one
audio
ward, he
bit.
had found the girl and two other women, one of whom was conscious but incapacitated by a leg and an arm in plaster. In another were two men, one of them his present companion, the other suffering from a broken leg, also in plaster. Altogether, there had been 11 people in the place, 8 of whom were sighted. Of the blind, 2 were bedridden and seriously ill. Of the staff, there was no sign at all. His experience had been, to begin with, more baffling than mine. They had stayed in the little hospital doing what they could for the helpless, wondering what on and hoping that someone would show up to help. They had no idea what was wrong with the 2 blind patients nor how to treat them. They could do nothing but feed and try to ease them. Both had died the next day. One man disappeared, and no one had seen him go. Those who were there for injuries suffered when the bus had overturned were local people. Once they were sufficiently recovered, they set out to find relatives. The party had dwindled down to 6, 2 of whom had broken limbs. By now they had realized that the breakdown was big enough to mean that they must fend for themselves for a time at least. But they were still far from grasping its full extent. the hospital and find some more convenient place, but they imagined that many more sighted people would exist in the cities and that disorganization would have brought mob rule. Daily they were expecting the arrival of these mobs when the food stores in the towns should be finished, and had pictured them moving like a locust army across the countryside. Their chief concern, therefore, had been to gather supplies in preparation for a siege. With our assurances that that was the least likely thing to happen, they looked at one another a little blankly. They were an oddly assorted trio. The fair-haired man turned out to be a member of the stock exchange by the name of Stephen Brennell. His companion was a good-looking, well-built girl with an occasional superficial petulance but no real surprise over whatever life might hand her next. She had led one of those fringe careers, modeling dresses, selling them, putting in movie extra work, missing opportunities of going to Hollywood, hostessing for obscure clubs, and helping out these activities by such other means as offered themselves, the intended holiday in Cornwall being apparently one such. She had an utterly unshakable conviction that nothing serious could have happened to America, and that it was only a matter of holding out for a while until the Americans arrived to put everything in order. She was quite the least troubled person I had encountered since the catastrophe took place, though just occasionally she pined a little for the bright lights which she hoped the Americans would hurry up and restore. The third member, the dark young man, nursed a grudge. He had worked hard and saved hard in order to start his small radio store, and he had ambitions. Look at Ford, he told us. And look at Lord Nuffield. He started with a bike shop no bigger than my radio store and see where he got to. That's the kind of thing I was going to do. And now look at the damn mess things are in. It ain't fair. Fate, as he saw it, didn't want any more Fords or Nuffields, but he didn't intend to take that line down. This was only an interval sent to try him. One day would see him back in his radio store with his foot set firmly on the first rung to millionaire. The most disappointing thing about them was to find that they knew nothing of the Michael Beadley party. Indeed, the only group they had encountered was in a village just over the Devon border, where a couple of men with shotguns had advised them not to come that way again. Those men, they said, were obviously local. Lucas suggested that that meant a small group. If they belonged to a large one, they'd have shown less nervousness and more curiosity, he maintained. But if the Beadley lot are around here, we ought to be able to find them somehow. He put it to the fair man. Look here, suppose we come along with you. We can do our work, and when we do find them, it'll make things easier for all of us. The three of them looked questioningly at one another, and then nodded. All right, give us a hand with the loading and we'll be getting along. The man agreed. By the look of Charcote Old House, it had once been a fortified manor. Re-fortification was now underway. At some time in the past, the encircling moat had been drained. Stephen, however, was of the opinion that he had successfully ruined the drainage system so that it would fill up again by degrees. It was his plan to blow up such parts as had been filled in, and thus complete the re-encirclement. Our news, suggesting that this might not be necessary, induced a slight wistfulness in him, and a look of disappointment. The stone walls of the house were thick. At least 3 of the windows in the front displayed machine guns, and he pointed out 2 more mounted on the roof. Inside the main door was stacked a small arsenal of mortars and bombs, and as he proudly showed us, several flamethrowers. We found an arms depot, he explained, and spent a day getting this lot together. As I looked over the stuff, I realized for the first time that the catastrophe by its very thoroughness had been more merciful than the things that would have followed a slightly lesser disaster. Had 10 or 15% of the population remained unharmed, it was very likely that little communities like this would indeed have found themselves fighting off starving gangs in order to preserve their own lives. As things were, however, Stephen had probably made his warlike preparations in vain. But there was one appliance that could be put to good use. I pointed to the flamethrowers. Those might be handy for Triffids, I said. He grinned. You're right. Very effective. The one thing we've used them for. And incidentally, the one thing I know that really makes a Triffid beat it. You can go on firing at them until they're shot to bits and they don't budge. I suppose they don't know where the destruction's coming from. But one warm lick from this and they're plunging off fit to bust themselves. Have you had a lot of trouble with them? I asked. It seemed that they had not. From time to time, 1, perhaps 2 or 3 would approach and be scorched away. On their expeditions, they had had several lucky escapes, but usually they were out of their vehicles only in built-up areas where there was little likelihood of prowling Triffids. That night, after dark, we all went up to the roof. It was too early for the moon. We looked out upon an utterly black landscape. Search it as we would, not one of us was able to discover the least pinpoint of a telltale light. Nor could any of them recall ever having seen a trace of smoke by day. I was feeling depressed when we descended again to the lamplit living room. There's only one thing for it then, Yoko said. We'll have to divide the district up into areas and search them. But he did not say it with conviction. I suspected that he was thinking it likely, as I was, that the Beadley party would continue to show a deliberate light by night and some other sign, probably a smoke column by day. However, no one had any better suggestion to make, so we got down to the business of dividing the map up into sections, doing our best to contrive that each should include some high ground to give an extensive view beyond it. The following day we went into the town in a lorry, and from there dispersed in smaller cars for the search. That was, without a doubt, the most melancholy day I had spent since I had wandered about Westminster searching for traces of Josena then. Just at first it wasn't too bad. There was the open road and the sunlight, the fresh green of early summer. There were signposts which pointed to Exeter and the west, and other places as if they still pursued their habitual lives. There were sometimes, though rarely, birds to be seen. And there were wild flowers beside the lanes, looking as they had always looked. But the other side of the picture was not so good. There were fields in which cattle lay dead, or wandered blindly, and untended cows lowed in pain. Where sheep in their easy discouragement had stood resignedly to die rather than pull themselves free from bramble or barbed wire, and other sheep grazed erratically, or starved with looks of reproach in their blind eyes. Farms were becoming unpleasant places to pass closely. For safety's sake, I was leaving myself only an inch of ventilation at the top of the window, but I closed even that whenever I saw a farm beside the road ahead. Triffids were at large. Sometimes I saw them crossing fields or noticed them inactive against hedges.